All right. So, true. Today we have a very special guest, the founder of Synthetix and one of my favorite thinkers from the crypto space, Kain Warwick. Pumped to have you, mate. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
So, we will start directly with your fixed tweet that says the following. If you are building something in crypto and it hasn't been called a scam yet, keep grinding. You'll get there. It's from 2019, and if it's still there, is it safe to assume that not much has changed in the meantime?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a trope that anything that gets any attention at all, there's going to be someone who's going to accuse it of being some kind of a scam, right? So it's basically saying like if you haven't got any attention yet for your project, keep going, and eventually someone will pay attention to it and call it a scam.
Are you still facing those comments even after Synthetix became like a well-known project in the crypto space?
No, no, not so much anymore. But I do see it happen to projects that I'm supporting or that I like. I watch it kind of happen in real time. I think probably the most recent one would be like Ohm. It's a very controversial project. There's people who love it. There's people who say it's a scam, it's a Ponzi or whatever. And I think it's just a classic crypto thing. If you don't like something, the easiest thing to do is call it a scam and call it a day, right? So
Yeah, so it's still rooted in our reality,
still
unfortunately.
true, still true,
Still
still
true.
true. Yeah, yeah.
So, remaining in 2019, in a blog post, you wrote the following. In order for Synthetix to deliver on its potential, it must become an open and unstoppable protocol. We took that concept and spoke in our recent Stakeborg DAO white paper about an unstoppable DAO. Can you elaborate on how you've seen things back then and how your perspective has changed in the meantime regarding this concept of unstoppable protocol?
Yeah, so I think that what we need to achieve with DAO governance is a very kind of robust set of rules and processes that are not capturable, right? And at the moment, for most DAOs, there are still discretionary elements, right? And this is true even of Synthetix. So within Synthetix, while we do have legitimate bodies like our protocol DAO, and the protocol DAO is made up of core contributors who have met some criteria. So there's a specific criteria they need to meet in order to be able to be elected to this protocol DAO. There are 11 of them. Those people have to still make a decision themselves to an extent about whether or not to actually implement a change that has been voted in by the Smart Council. This is problematic because if someone were to be able to capture that group of people and say, okay, protocol DAO, we've rounded you up somehow and we don't want you to make this change because we don't like it, then the protocol would be effectively blocked from making changes, right? And that would be very problematic. So one of the things that I think we found over the last year in DAO governance is that we have all of these discretionary elements that have crept in. There's snapshot, which is a signal, and then someone has to go and take a multi-sig and implement that signal. That's a very dangerous thing, right? That break point there between the signal and the implementation is problematic. So within Synthetix V3 governance, we're looking to fix that by closing that gap and saying, rather than having an off-chain signal that's then implemented on-chain by a discretionary body, we are going to have a mechanism where it's an on-chain signal that is implemented with certain restrictions and rules and processes and can be overridden by token holders. There can be intervention points, etc. But it's going to be a much more robust and non-discretionary process. It's all going to happen on chain. There's going to be very clear and transparent rules. There's going to be no way for someone to capture or inject themselves into the process. It's a challenging thing to build. But I'm pretty comfortable that we've got the right structure in place now and the right specification so that when we implement that and we release it as an open source piece of tooling for the community, that like the compound governance module, like Snapshot, it's going to be something that a lot of projects will adopt.
Is this version 3 of the governance the reason why the old dictator reappeared?
Yes and no. So the main reason why I had to reappear is we didn't have very good structures around the core contributors, right? So core contributors within Synthetix are people, the definition is it's someone who's paid a monthly grant in order to do some action or perform some role within the DAO. And so it's a very strict definition, right? You're either paid a monthly grant, you do that thing, you perform that action, you perform that service or whatever. If you aren't paid a monthly grant directly from the DAO, then you're just a community member, right? And the core contributors are obviously a very critical piece of governance infrastructure within the protocol. When I stepped back earlier this year to make room for the Spartan Council and some of the other governance structures we put in place to really make sure that they had the autonomy to go out and kind of manage the protocol. What happened was the core contributors lost cohesion, to put it mildly. And we went, we have 45 people now in 25 different cities. So, when you lose someone who was a primary coordination point and you have a very flat structure, there's not much hierarchy, there isn't too much rigidity in the structure, it really devolved very quickly. And so what I found is that, I needed to come back and work out a way that we could put some more formal and legitimate governance processes specifically for the core contributor group to ensure that in the future, when again I step back and maybe I'm not managing and organizing the core contributors day to day, that the structure would remain in place and that we would have the right processes to allow the core contributors to be effective.
Have you felt it like a defeat? The fact that you had to come back?
Look, Synthetix, I guess if you view that sort of thing as a defeat, then Synthetix has been a continuous series of defeats since the very beginning, right? Because we run iterative experiments, and you run an iterative experiment, you test something out, you see what the result is, you have a hypothesis, and you go and implement some process, and in crypto, most of the time, right? On balance, they fail. Most of the time, the things don't work, right? Especially the first time, right? So even with yield farming, the early yield farming attempts that we did, there were multiple iterations that we went through of like how to get this yield farming working. It wasn't until we landed on this idea of using Uniswap with ETH and SETH funded by SNX with the right staking contract, and that iteration to kind of get to that point where all of a sudden it took off. People don't see all of the failures up until the point where the rocket ship launched, right? But there were a lot of failures between that and the actual the process kind of gaining traction.
And then you are seen like a genius.
Yeah, then people go, "Oh, that's amazing! Like you guys are so smart, right? You just did this thing and it worked, right?" But again, it wasn't even. In fact, I was on the wrong side of those debates most of the time when we were discussing it. I was actually pushing for a different direction most of the time. So it was multiple people within the community that were able to kind of convince me that my kind of thesis was wrong, and we got it right eventually. So the yield farming thing was very much a Synthetix organic community effort. It certainly didn't come from me. If it had been up to me alone, I don't think it would have happened.
So now we are seeing the power of the community in these kind of like structures, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you see Synthetix in the next few years more like a contributor to let's say more to the DGov part of the crypto, or more to the DeFi part of the crypto?
I mean, there's a lot of different protocols out there that are trying to do derivatives, right? That are trying to, offer tokenized exposure to real world assets or, perpetual futures or whatever. I still believe that Synthetix has the right mechanism to be a dominant player in that market. But in terms of what in maybe 10 years time, people will remember Synthetix for when they look back. I think it will be not just the DeFi component. It will be, a number of things. It will be yield farming. It will be, this idea of kind of inflationary tokens being paid out to participants in the network. It will be our governance structures. It'll be the idea of dissolving these foundations that everyone had this dumb idea in 2016, 2017 to go to Switzerland and set up a foundation, right? And now we're all realizing that was actually idiotic. Synthetix was one of the first ones to put our hand up and say, sorry, we were idiots, we're going to shut this thing down, right? And so I think we're seeing Maker do it. We're seeing a lot of people come around to this idea that actually today in 2021, it's possible to run as a pure DAO. And in fact, it's optimal to run as a pure DAO. The tooling is still not perfect. And I think maybe next year we will get much better tooling, and it'll become just obvious that a pure DAO is the optimal structure. At the moment, the trade-offs are painful. But by next year, I think the trade-offs will be very, very low to move into a pure DAO mode of operating.
What's the future of the DAOs from a legal perspective?
That's a good question. Someone that I respect a lot is Hart Lambert from UMA, and we had a conversation a few months ago on a podcast, and he made this point, which it was the first time that I'd heard it articulated this way, but it was really, really powerful. Was that all of the financial sort of systems that we've had in history have all been very regionalized, right? They've been, regionalized to a specific city or a city state, in sort of historical times, or to a nation state now in kind of modern times, maybe even to like a zone, of nation states like the Eurozone or whatever. Yep. But they're very, very fragmented and they're not, there's no kind of global layer, right? It just hasn't been possible. There's been individual regulatory structures and all kinds of idiosyncratic weird things you need to deal with. Even in the US, it's total clusterfuck, right? You try and go and start a financial services company, you need to go to every single state, get licenses, it's madness, right? And so this idea of Ethereum being this global financial infrastructure that is sitting in a layer that, kind of transcends individual nation states, the world is going to have to come to terms with this, right? The world is going to need to find a way to agree about how all of the people are going to interact with this, because it's not like we can have a situation where there are no regulations. I think that kind of utopian idea is not reasonable. I think we need new regulations, but I think we're going to need a new regulatory regime that recognizes and respects the fact that we now have a global financial system in a way that we never had before, because we never had the right platform, and Ethereum is that platform.
So you believe that in terms of regulation, we will see with DAOs what we will probably see with securities as well, as in we will not be able to place the crypto space into the old, let's say, rules of what is a security and what's not, and probably we will need a new asset class with new rules and everything.
So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways that this can go in my mind, right? And I don't have a strong sense of which particular path we'll go down, but I think that, the next 10 years is going to be very path dependent around, what happens over the next couple of years in terms of the regulatory response from different jurisdictions. But you could imagine a scenario where a DAO is kind of non-jurisdictional, right? But the recipients of funds from a DAO are humans, right? They're natural persons, right? And a natural person has to reside somewhere, right? They need to be domiciled somewhere. So you can imagine a scenario where you might have 10,000 participants in a DeFi protocol, all of whom are collectively providing some service, and they are being compensated for providing that service with some kind of revenue. And that revenue will be taxable in whichever jurisdiction they happen to reside, right? But the DAO itself will be kind of not domiciled anywhere, right? This is kind of the situation we have now, but I think it might be more clear. At the moment, it's very ambiguous. I think that there'll be more clarity around this, and it'll be at the periphery, at the kind of natural person level, right? That will need to reconcile this. There's other paths though. You can imagine other paths where the nation state has had a good run, right? It's been operating for a while. It's very possible that concept could be disrupted, right? It's very hard sometimes to kind of really remove all of your biases and all of your kind of assumptions that you start with. We've all grown up in this idea of there's 300 nation states out there, and they've got the little plot of land, and they kind of run around with guns and protected and whatever. Like, that's not necessarily the most sane state for the world to be in, right? You can imagine something that would be much more amorphous than that. And so I do think that there are a number of different paths we could go down. I try not to be too utopianist about it, but I think that the power of Ethereum and what it enables is going to be very transformational in the world in ways that we probably can't really predict. And I think that all of us working in the space need to really make sure that we're sort of cognizant of the direction things are heading in, and make sure that we're happy with that direction, because it can go both ways. It could become very dystopian, or it becomes more utopian. But it's up to us to kind of guide that.
So my background is in history, and the white paper that we've recently launched today, when we're actually filming this, has this, let's say, historical flavor when it comes to the role of the nation state in our lives, and the fact that we are moving in a direction where the nation state will be in competition for the individuals that will give the most benefits to those nation states. Because if the DAO will be, in a way or another, a concept that will be very present in our lives, it will be less important if you live in Australia or in Romania. So the nation state will say, okay, well, we actually cannot regulate that, because the DAO is just a concept, and you agree that you are part of a concept, and we cannot deny a concept because it's just fucking pure theory. So we will control whatever we can control, and that is you being inside our borders and contributing to the budget that we will be spending, like always, discretionary. So we might see a future when that will happen, and probably that's equal to a time where creativity will become one of the most monetizable skills that we could have, I guess, which didn't happen in the past, right?
I mean, if you look at the history of the nation state, you have a small number of elite, and the rest of the people are effectively serfs, right? Even going back into the US, which is probably fairly enlightened, comparatively to a lot of nation states historically. Like, there was no mobility, right? Like, you're on a farm somewhere, and you're not going anywhere. I think as the productivity of the world increases, and mobility increases, and everyone is kind of lifted out of this idea of serfdom, people will expect a level of freedom. I mean, look at crypto people now. It's hard for me to track down at any given time where most of my friends are, right? I send them a message, and they're in Europe or the US, or they're in Hong Kong or wherever. That's even factoring COVID, right? So I do think that we will have a sort of flexibility and mobility, more kind of, they'll be more prevalent globally, and that alone will put pressure on the nation state, as people have an expectation, particularly younger generations, of being able to move around more freely than they may have in the past.
Do you think the nation state, actually the people who are right now the nation state, because even nation state is a concept similar to DAO, isn't it? Do you think they have the tools, the mindset, I don't know, the perspective to actually understand what's happening?
Not right now. And, I mean, there was a joke on Twitter a couple of weeks ago where someone said, the average age of the US senator is 74 years old or whatever, and the average age of like a DeFi 2.0 engineer is 7 years old or whatever, right? And it's like, on some level, if you read like someone like Kuhn, for example, right? Philosopher of science and the structure of scientific revolutions, you need the old guard to effectively die, right? In order to kind of replace them with these new concepts. The world is transforming far faster even than like generational kind of transitions are capable of managing. But I do think that we have this idea of, particularly in younger generations, that they're far more adaptable, and the people who are notionally in charge of these nation states are not that adaptable. They're old. They don't get what's going on, and there's no question that that's going to cause tension in the future, because the acceleration and kind of transformation that we're seeing in society due to these technological improvements, including things like Ethereum and cryptocurrency, are just going to put more and more pressure and create more and more distance between those generations, and that's going to come to a head somehow, right? There's going to be some reckoning that's going to come.
Speaking of generations, how often do you feel old in crypto? Because I'm 33, and whenever I'm speaking to our community here in Romania, and we have like quite some people here, and I speak with them, and then when I ask, but you look like very young and you have some ideas that probably I didn't have like back then, and the answer is I'm 21, I'm 19, and I was like, what the fuck? Since when people who are 21 care about such things? Because when I was 21, all I was interested in was like drinking and partying, isn't it? And now you see such things, and I was wondering, how often do you feel like, holy smokes, I'm old in crypto?
I'm almost 41. I turned 41 in a couple of days, right? So I'm pretty old by crypto standards. I think I was, when I was younger, right? When I was like in my early 20s, I was very interested in the political structure of the world, right? And how the world was coordinated. And I had a very deep sense that it was inefficient, right? I felt very strongly about that. And that was kind of one of the things that drove me to work in startups, was this idea that you could go and build something new that could significantly change how the world operated. And I think now, as I've gotten older, it's very nice to speak to people who are in their 20s or whatever, because they're still very idealistic, and I think you can become a bit jaded. But I'm still an optimist, even 20 years later from when I was 20 years old or whatever. I'm still very optimistic about our ability to improve the world, and I think that the younger generation is maybe more empowered to do that due to all of the technological improvements that we've seen in terms of communication, et cetera, than maybe I was when I was 20. You're reading pamphlets and weird books and things like that. Now you've got a lot more tools at your disposal, including smart contracts. And so I'm hopeful. I think younger generations are very idealistic, and I think that the tools are there to really improve the world. And I think that in the next decade or two, a lot of the incumbent power structures that have held back progress and had entrenched interests and created maybe unfair outcomes are going to be significantly disrupted.
Do you think, is it important to be idealistic in crypto? Because we are seeing like every day we are seeing like all kind of, let's say, episodes that are that are like punches that are saying like, look, crypto is all about money, profits. It's all about like building something, taking some quick money because there is money everywhere in crypto. You take money, you build something, and then whatever happens. Is it important to be idealistic in crypto?
I'm a markets person, right? Like I strongly believe in markets as a solution to problems, right? I think having efficient markets is kind of critical to ensuring that you solve problems. I think that there are obviously some things that are not amenable to market-based solutions necessarily, and might need higher level coordination. But that higher level coordination, our only option previously was really the nation state, right? And we've seen how complacent nation states have become, and how slow moving, and so I think that the time is sort of ripe for disrupting that, and maybe changing how we coordinate large groups of people. But ultimately, I believe that the speculative aspects and all of those things that a lot of people find maybe distasteful about crypto are part of markets. That is how markets operate, right? And so capital allocation and efficient markets and all of those sorts of things just rely on, to an extent, this idea that you're going to have scams, and you're going to have poor investments, and you're going to have inefficiencies, but ultimately you're moving towards a more efficient market. And so whether you're idealistic or whether you're very opportunistic, you're still contributing to the market, right? To some extent. And I think that as long as we ensure that markets are fair and transparent and efficient, it doesn't matter which of those participants are there or what the mix of them is. Directionally, you're going the right way.
I was thinking about what you were saying right now, and 1,000 questions are flowing in my mind. Do you think DAOs and, let's say, traditional companies will work together, or it will be more a fight for territory? Because it's difficult for me to understand how could we have traditional companies actually understanding how the framework that is needed in order to collaborate with a DAO, probably. And on top of that, I think at a certain point in time, they will be seeing that as a way, a black hole that extracts all the value, the talented people, the people who want to be free and have money, not only have money and sell their time and so on and so forth. So how do you see this story with two very different outcomes?
Again, the kind of trajectory of technological progress and the speed at which transformation is occurring is only accelerating, right? And one of the best indicators of this is if you look at what were the top companies by market cap over the last 100 years. You go back 100 years ago, and for 30 years it was like 3 companies, right? And then 50 years ago it was another 10 companies, and now the turnover of companies, and you look at what are the top companies today, none of them were there 20 years ago. None of them were at the top, right? And so this idea that a new coordination mechanism, and DAOs are obviously in competition. DAOs are a way of coordinating people to provide a service. And people then consume those services in the same way that a corporation coordinates people to provide a service, and then people consume that service. DAOs are going to outcompete corporations, right? So I think that there will be a period where you have a mixture of incumbent corporations that have been around for a long time and have entrenched moats that they built or whatever that are hard to disrupt, and then you're going to have some DAOs that come along and just chop them in half and eviscerate them, really. And eventually you're going to have a situation where most of the large coordination mechanisms are more DAO-like than corporation-like. It may end up be that there's some sort of hybrid for a while, but it seems to me, at least, and again, I'm fairly optimistic, but it seems to me that the end state is that DAOs will outcompete corporations. It may take a decade or two, And we may have a period where, there's a balance and in some areas DAOs are winning, in some areas corporations continue to dominate. But I think it's inevitable that DAOs will replace corporations, as corporations were, replaced by partnerships were replaced by corporations, et cetera. You go back through history, look at all the different ways of kind of coordinating people. There's been these sort of structural realignments as some new process has been discovered or implemented.
In order for the DAOs to succeed, do you think it's more a problem of, let's say, solving solutions like the ones you mentioned? Who is voting? How do we shape the voting, and so on and so forth? It's more like a technical solution, or is more, let's say, useful and transformational the change in the mindset of the people that are part of these DAOs or will be part of these DAOs?
My view is that governance within DAOs and governance within corporations is probably not as different as some people think that it is, right? Or expect that it will be. In a corporation, you have, a very hierarchical process. You've got shareholders and a board, and then you've got, executives, and then all the way through employees, et cetera. And it's very hierarchical, and there's process flows around who has authority to do what, et cetera. With a DAO at the moment, it seems much more chaotic, right? But I think what we're doing is we're starting to find ways of creating similar processes and flows and roles within DAOs and authority and hierarchy, et cetera. In a corporation, the vast majority of the equity holders in a corporation do not care or do not vote, right? Particularly when you look at things like index funds, et cetera, there's very little governance that actually happens, right? The governance happens, at the board level, at the executive level, et cetera. And it's only in exceptional circumstances where, people step in and that becomes problematic. I think we'll see the same thing at DAOs. I think that we will have people who hold tokens, who, just want to hold tokens because they want exposure to that particular coordination mechanism that's going to provide a service and is producing some cash flow. And then you'll have a core group of enthusiasts or contributors or whatever who hold a lot of tokens, who are really dedicated to that particular thing. And I think the main difference is not necessarily in how they're governed or what the governance processes is or whatever, but the difference will be that DAOs by default are open. Corporations by default are closed, right? They're a walled garden. They try and keep people out. The processes are very opaque. With a DAO, the processes are open. They're composable. You can connect to them. The software that they're running is open source. All of the processes are transparent. All the flows are transparent. That's where I think the efficiency is going to come from. And I think that's why DAOs will ultimately outcompete, not because there's some significantly better way of coordinating people or governing or whatever, but I think it's in the actual framework under which they operate.
Yeah, makes total sense. I will ask you something regarding a debate you have with SBF a year ago or so. It's
clearly I lost, by the way. He's worth $100 trillion, and
many people lost with him. So it's clear. It's clear for everyone that he has a pretty good understanding of the crypto environment, and still, I'm curious to know, when it comes to his approach, where do you think he could be pretty wrong?
I think he's fundamentally wrong. And I think that, I genuinely mean that, right? I think what he has done is exceptional in the sense that he came into an inefficient market, right? And he applied traditional sort of control mechanisms, right? Traditional corporate control mechanisms, a very hierarchical organization, a very organized organization, a very structured organization. And he outcompeted all of the other centralized services and ran rings around them, right? Even something like a Binance, for example, which looked very impressive to all the DAOs that were running around, in circles, not knowing how to kind of organize themselves. Binance looked like something that was like really unassailable, right? And SBF came in and said, actually, I'm going to build something that's even more efficient, even more focused. And he is such a dedicated and driven and focused person that he just out executed everyone, right? But he still was out executing everyone in the old legacy framework, right? But there's a weird thing where you've got TradFi and corporations and everything over here, right, out in the real world, and then you've got centralized crypto things, right? And then you've got DeFi, DAOs, and various other things, right? And there's a spectrum within these categories, right? He came in and just blew everyone away in this middle category of, I'm going to be centralized, but I'm going to crush all of you. And he did, right? He has unequivocally crushed everyone. And you have to kind of, shake your head at how amazing that was, because I think a lot of people didn't believe that was possible to come in and just blow everyone away. But on the longer kind of trajectory of time, right? This section over here, the DAO section, right? And again, there's a continuum of how centralized these DAOs are, and some things are much more centralized than others. You've got Yearn, which is super decentralized, and then Synthetix, which is pretty decentralized, and other things which are a bit more centralized. We will win. Like, we have history on our side. We will defeat him. All of the centralized exchanges, all of the centralized services are going to be undermined and going to be outcompeted by DAOs. We just need to get our shit together and get the tooling right and get all the process right. And it's going to take longer and it's harder, but we will ultimately prevail here. And I don't think that SBF and CZ and some of these guys who are operating in this centralized, kind of mindset have it in them to go the other direction, right? To actually, open things up, make it more transparent, more DAO-like. I think they're going to double down and they're just going to, go ahead. But eventually we will win. I'm very confident. It may take 3 years or it may take 5 years, but time is on our side.
Do you think, is there any ideological difference between CZ and SBF?
Not really. I just think SBF is much more effective at what he does. I think they both have a very similar mindset of, really clear execution, really, very rigid structures around how they operate, very hierarchical organizations, and focus, right? They're both very, very focused people. I mean, CZ did the exact same thing to everyone, like 18 months before
Exactly.
SBF did it to everyone else, right? Like, they just came in and saw a really inefficient market and said, I'm going to outcompete you, but I'm going to outcompete you using the legacy TradFi approach, right? The corporate approach. I'm just going to build a really efficient corporation within the crypto ecosystem, right? Over here, we're not building efficient corporations. We're building new tooling for coordination for DAOs. And we believe that those DAOs will be much more effective coordination mechanisms than corporations. And that's why, again, I think that, time is on our side.
Why do you think PancakeSwap had multiple days with better volumes that Uni or Sushi or whatever other example you might choose?
Gas prices, right? Like, we just didn't scale fast enough. It's pretty obvious. Like, it's quite interesting when you think about, like, Binance Smart Chain was an absolute laughable joke for a long time, like a really long time. We would laugh about it all the time because no one used it. It was utterly pointless. It was completely centralized. And it wasn't until there was a market pressure coming from gas fees and gas prices on Ethereum that actually got people to shift over, right? It languished in obscurity for a long time. It had smart contracts for like, a year or something, and there were no smart contracts deployed there, right? Like, I don't even think the Binance people bothered to deploy smart contracts on there, right? And then all of a sudden we got to a point where the market shifted, and post kind of Black Thursday, when gas prices really went through the roof, and we realized that we actually had too much economic activity on Ethereum L1 to handle what was happening, and that under high volatility conditions, gas prices were just not sustainable. All of a sudden, there was a reason for people to actually look at alternatives, and one of the obvious alternatives was an EVM compatible super centralized chain. I Stanley gave me a joke a long time ago, which is one of those capture things, right? And it's like select all of the Binance Smart Chain validators, and it's just like 9 photos of CZ, and it's probably one of the funniest jokes I've ever seen, right? But like, you know, no one had any suspicion that like this is not a totally centralized solution, right? But the alternative was that everyone who had less than $50,000 was priced out of being able to interact with these systems. So of course, when PancakeSwap and some of these other clones of ETH protocols launched on Binance Smart Chain, people went over. It was the same thing with Polygon, right? You know, Polygon was super cheap, even though the security profile was, I mean, Polygon is orders of magnitude better than BSC, right? But it's still a huge trade-off in terms of security, right? And it's not an ideal security trade-off, and it's one of the reasons why I've kind of advocated for not necessarily deploying Synthetix on there and some of the other high-profile smart contracts. But ultimately, the reason why it worked is because gas prices were just too high, and we didn't scale fast enough, and we got to a point where people were priced out. They needed an alternative.
So basically, the window of opportunity was created by being inefficient on the Ethereum side.
We fucked up. We absolutely fucked up. If we had been able to get our shit together and get some kind of scaling solution, and it's not to say there was nothing. XDAI was there, but XDAI obviously had some limitations in terms of what sort of things it could support, but it could support token transfers and things like that, and people were kind of using it. So XDAI had been around since, I think it launched in like DevCon 4 or something like that, but it just wasn't really sufficient as a scaling solution to kind of keep people off. Really, Matic / Polygon was the only Ethereum aligned solution. But unfortunately, at the same time, you had BSC, you had even Tron for a while. There were a bunch of Tron clones. People were using that. It was cheap. People, the end user, if they're priced out, is going to go somewhere else. If they want to interact with services and they can't afford to interact on Ethereum L1, they're going to go somewhere else.
Speaking of layer 1 wars, do you think the stake is to have as many users as possible, or it is more important to be as friendly as possible to the developers?
Ultimately, the developers are the ones who make the choices around the trade-offs of the network that they build on, right? Users don't make those decisions. They don't care, really, right? They're looking for the optimal user experience, right? They want the widest range of services, the cheapest prices to access them, the best liquidity, the best fills, whatever criteria, whatever service they're using. It's up to engineers to make the decision about some of the less obvious trade-offs, right? So if you go to BSC and you think that everything is amazing and you're all safe and happy, and then one day CZ switches off all the validators, you're fucked, right? And so you as an end user may not realize that, but as an engineer, you need to question, which platform do I want to build a service that's going to have longevity on, right? That's going to be credible. Because as the engineer who's building that service, if CZ switches off the validators one day, then your service is dead as well, right? And so I think it's engineers who are kind of, it's beholden on them to make the right choices. But I think a lot of engineers and a lot of people, particularly who are just cloning things on EVM compatible chains, didn't care, because they just said, well, there's an opportunity here for me to go and fork Uniswap or fork whatever and deploy it on BSC. And there's so much demand because the cost of transacting on L1 that I'm going to get users regardless. And, it was a very opportunistic approach to the problem, but that's just kind of the way it went, unfortunately.
So we have on one hand Ethereum and all the others Ethereum virtual machine compatible chains, and on the other side, let's say we have the likes of Solana, Elrond, who are projects that are built on Rust. Is it like wrong to say that there is more danger coming from actually, let me rephrase that because I don't even understand how to exactly put it. Do you think there is more danger coming from a protocol that is written in a different language, or is it more because we both know that the engineers that are on the Solidity side, they don't really like to go and do things in Rust.
Mhm.
But is it enough, let's say, attractive to have shitloads of transactions and cheap transactions in order to attract enough talent that is willing to do this trade-off of, okay, I'll fucking learn this Rust thing just because probably this looks like the most possible Ethereum killer?
There is no question that Solana is the most credible bet to Ethereum. Like, no question. It absolutely, unequivocally, right? I don't think there's anything else that even comes close. And, we have SBF to a large extent to thank for that as well, right? Like, and this is, kind of the interesting thing as well. As much as SBF has gone out and been, running a very corporate kind of, top-down hierarchical playbook and running it exceptionally well, he also, was smart enough to align himself with a network that, and again, we had this debate, and I think he's right. His view is very probably rationally that if we all collectively agreed today to just stop using Ethereum and move over to Solana, that it would be better for the ecosystem, right? If we could all coordinate to move over there. Now, I disagree with that for a couple of reasons. One, I think that Solana is less decentralized than Ethereum, right? And I think that the trade-offs that it makes are maybe not the optimal set of trade-offs, but certainly there's a decent argument for to make that case, right? That actually it's fine. There's enough validators. Yes, the hardware requirements are much higher, et cetera. But ultimately, the combination of aligning with Solana, which is a very credible threat to Ethereum, as well as building FTX into the behemoth that it is, it's brilliant. He's a genius, right? Like there's no question of that, right? If it wasn't for SBF, I don't think Solana is nearly as much of a threat to Ethereum as it is today. But I do think that ultimately Ethereum will get there, and I think that by the time we get to early next year, we're going to have multiple production ready roll-ups. We're going to be getting closer to the merge. We're going to be getting closer to this idea of ETH2 as a data availability layer. We're going to have the ability to maintain composability across various protocols, etc. And I think that we will be able to kind of chip away at this sort of meme of Solana as faster or better or whatever, cheaper, etc. And I think that the momentum that Ethereum has, particularly around tooling, and people underestimate this, right? There's years and years of incredible tooling that's been built up around the Ethereum ecosystem that make even though Solidity is not maybe the optimal programming language in the world, the tooling really makes a huge difference, right? So it's going to be a very tough competition, and it's not inevitable at all that Ethereum wins, but I'm still very confident that Ethereum will win out in the end. And I think that with these L1 networks, it's a winner take most situation. The same way that if you look at the infrastructure that the internet runs on, it all runs on Linux, right? Like there's a very tiny minority of other weird and wonderful operating systems that that are out there, but the vast majority of the internet runs on Linux, and I think that will be the same thing for decentralized finance and Web3. It's all going to run on Ethereum. There might be some niche things that do some other stuff for whatever reason. There's different trade-offs or whatever, but I'm pretty confident that Ethereum comes out ahead.
Yesterday you had a 50 tweets rant about the future of DeFi. I wasn't even able, like Twitter was not showing me exactly, so it was difficult for me to find part one because it was just part two, and I was like, holy smokes, from where is this starting from? So this 50 tweets rant was about the future of DeFi, and it was coming from someone saying that, well, what we've seen last year with the DeFi summer was like the top of the tops, and from now on is just like going down.
It's all
from
downhill.
Yes.
Yeah.
So without getting into all the arguments that you mentioned there, because we will put the tweet storms in the description, why do you think DeFi is less sexy than the NFTs, even for the long term? Because for the short term, it's obviously why. And it's also pretty easy to understand the fact that NFTs are pretty visual, when DeFi is more like economics and mathematics and so on and so forth. But what's the main, let's say, what was the main catalyst of extracting the liquidity from DeFi and seeing that liquidity moving into NFTs?
I think, the main indicator for me, right, is if you look at over the last 5 years, let's say, right, the dominant narratives, right, you have the ICO narrative from like 2016 through to 2018 or whatever, and some sketchy celebrities got involved in that and were shilling ICOs and whatever, but it was very much pay to play, and it was all, there wasn't really much organic interest, right, from cultural people, right, cultural icons or celebrities or whatever. Then you had DeFi Summer, and you had a few weird and wonderful people like Mark Cuban who kind of got interested and got excited in DeFi and were shilling DeFi. But the wave of attention that NFTs have garnered from such a wide range of people in such a wide range of fields, from musicians to sports people to actors to whatever, right, has just been so obvious, right, in hindsight, that NFTs as cultural artifacts, as ways of kind of combining this idea of self-custody with culture, is just going to be a much larger driver of activity and attention than DeFi will be. But I think there's a distinction. So there's attention, and then there's impact, right? And I tweeted about this a while ago. The latest Marvel movie is high attention, low impact. It doesn't change the world.
True.
No one gives a fuck 2 weeks later, right? But everyone pays attention to it for like 2 weeks, and then they forget about it, right? The major changes to financial regulations or upgrades to payment rails or whatever are not attention gathering. There's like a few hundred people who care at all, right? But in terms of the impact that they have, they touch everyone, because everyone uses credit cards. Everyone is subject to regulatory regimes in different jurisdictions. So attention and impact are somewhat decoupled, right? And I think DeFi is high impact. And I think it's going to change the world. And I think it's going to make the world more efficient, and it's going to create more open and transparent markets. But in terms of the number of people who will deeply care about that, it's a few tens of thousands of people. Whereas the latest NFT drop, might have tens of millions of people who care about it, right? But ultimately, both of those things, right? The latest NFT drop with tens of millions of people, and the transformation of traditional finance into decentralized finance, rely on the same rails, rely on the same UX patterns, rely on people understanding what self-custody and wallets and all of these things work. One of them is going to drive millions of users to kind of understand that. The other one is going to drive hundreds of users. And as we get millions of users who understand these UX patterns and get it in the same way that they understood websites and email and chat apps and all of these things, we're going to have a wave of adoption, and that's going to create this gigantic install base that DeFi people will be able to tap into much, much more easily. We were never going to get 50 million people to adopt Aave because it's so cool. I love Aave and it's amazing, but there aren't 50 million people in the world that give a fuck about it. I'm sorry, right? And so we're never going to do that. But when you have 50 million people who have like PFPs and cultural artifacts that are NFTs and have wallets and mobile wallets and all of these things, and they get how all of that works, they're going to go, wait a second, why am I putting my money, my dollars, right, into some fiat bank when I can have stable coins that I can put it into Aave and get 3% yield? That will be obvious to them. It wasn't enough to get them in the first place, but once they're here, that adjacency, right? That, the ability to kind of switch them over to this new paradigm is going to be far, far easier. And so I think that that's where the thesis kind of comes from, this idea that it's going to be NFTs that are the killer app that drives adoption of these UX patterns. Once everyone gets that, then DeFi becomes much easier.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense, especially since we will not solve the problems, the big problems of this world with NFTs. No matter how much we like them, they are cute. We can have them as profiles on Twitter. They can transform into characters in movies, in metaverse, and so on and so forth. They will not give banking to the people in Africa. They will not
Absolutely not
solve the main problems.
But they will be the vector, right, by which we get people to understand the UX patterns, right? Because people will make the effort to participate in culture, right? Everyone participates in culture, and if culture is becoming self-custodied and using, mobile wallets and all of these things, people will learn that. They'll learn how that works, right? Once they've learned how that works, then they're ripe to be, DeFi pilled, right? And we can bring them across into lending protocols and self-custody and all of the other cool stuff that we built.
You end your tweet storm with the following phrase: the end state is a world where most infrastructure runs on Ethereum. The dominant protocols will capture an insane amount of value, but they will do so by being open, transparent, and composable. We all gonna make it. When you say most infrastructure, is it 30%, 50%, 90%? I think you kind of answer with the Linux example, but I'm still wondering, do you really believe that 90% will be on Ethereum?
I guess it depends on what infrastructure, what categories we're talking about, right? In terms of financial infrastructure, I think it's probably 90% plus, right? Of the financial infrastructure, the end state is it will run on Ethereum, right? Now, whether it's roll-ups or some kind of zero knowledge solution or whatever, I think that's pretty obvious. When you get into like other types of infrastructure, things like data storage, et cetera, I think that's a bit harder to guess, because we still don't really have great decentralized file storage, and we've got IPFS and we've got some other solutions. But I think that's a bit more opaque to me. But the idea that the world's payment rails will run on Ethereum is just utterly inevitable to me. Like there's no question in my mind that that's the end state.
My last question is one that I asked Vitalik as well, because he was like the previous discussion I had was with Vitalik. And
it's a hard act to follow.
Yeah, it's a pretty good. It was the first episode with Vitalik, and now I have you, so I cannot be more grateful for having you guys as my first two guests. So let's imagine we are in 2009, and Kain is Satoshi, but you know everything that you learned afterwards. So with the mind and all the information that you have currently, you are back in 2009. What would you do to change the course of history?
That's a tough question. I think one of the things that has allowed Bitcoin to get to the point that it has is the fact that it is leaderless, right? And even though obviously Satoshi was the leader for a period of time, the fact that eventually Satoshi stepped back and opened it up to a community, I think is one of the key things, right? That was the driver for the adoption. I actually think the true driver for adoption was this idea, which Synthetix eventually adopted, of having the block reward paid out to people who were mining, right? Who learned how to mine and how to install the software and all that sort of stuff. I think that was the key thing. And so I don't think that anything else really would have driven adoption any more than that. I think that there's some obviously path dependent things that could have changed, but my sense is that I wouldn't change much about how these things have played out. Just for fear, like you get back in a time machine and you step on a bug, and all of a sudden, we're in a dystopia 10 years later. Like I'd be very worried to meddle with anything in 2009. I think I'd probably just let it play out as it has.
I realized that we've discussed for 1 hour about crypto and everything, and it was the first time when we said Bitcoin, which is like,
Yeah.
It's like pretty crazy if you think about it. It was unimaginable like 3-4 years ago. It was like crazy to say you can discuss 1 hour about this environment without mentioning Bitcoin. And I know I was saying it's my last question, but I'm curious, what's your, let's say, approach when you see all the maximalism there is on Twitter?
I might change my answer, actually. If I could go back in 2009, I might just invent Ethereum. If I was Satoshi and I knew everything, I might just skip over Bitcoin completely and just invent Ethereum. I think that we would have solved a lot of things a lot faster if we didn't have to deal with Bitcoin maxis. I do think that there is something very elegant about Bitcoin and much more simple to grok than Ethereum. I think, Ethereum may have struggled to get this level of adoption that Bitcoin did due to its greater complexity and all of that sort of stuff. But in terms of what I think about maximalism, I feel like there was this break point in like 2015 or whatever, right? Where we'd had a whole bunch of weird altcoins that were created, Litecoin and Mastercoin, et cetera, and they weren't really credible threats to Ethereum. Sorry, to Bitcoin. Until Ethereum. Ethereum was the first kind of credible threat to the attention that Bitcoin had within the ecosystem. And I think for a lot of people who were so passionate about Bitcoin, they couldn't separate that passion and belief for Bitcoin from the overarching goal, right? Which is this kind of self-sovereign money or whatever. And the fact that Ethereum is a better technology than Bitcoin, I think the cognitive dissonance for a lot of those people is just too great for them to be able to to kind of break away from. And so I think it's somewhat inevitable that we have Bitcoin maxis because they were especially the early ones, right? So many of them. Some people were able to break out of it. Look at someone like Eric Voorhees, right? I think he's a fairly open person to change and has the ability to change his mind and look at things from a fresh perspective. But I think there's a lot of people out there who just don't have that capacity. They were so passionate about Bitcoin they couldn't separate Bitcoin, the thing, from the concept of what Bitcoin was trying to achieve, right? And I think the people who were able to do that and who were able to kind of separate those two ideas, a lot of them ended up in the Ethereum ecosystem because it was just obvious that was going to be a more powerful solution to the same problem.
Don't you think that someone who is passionate about Solana will say that, well, Kain, he's an Ethereum maxi, similar to how we are seeing the Bitcoin maxis as well?
Yeah, agreed. And the difference between Solana and Ethereum is far less than the difference between Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? And so they're very nuanced points around why I prefer one over the other, right? With some slight changes, I could prefer Solana over Ethereum, right? It's not at some sort of ideological level that I dislike it, right? I just dislike the design choices that were made. I think they're the wrong design choices. But when it comes to whether Bitcoin or Ethereum is a more valuable thing for society, it's very clear to me that Ethereum is more valuable for society in the long run. Now, Bitcoin has a very dear place in my heart because it was the first thing, and so of course I love it. I think the concept of Bitcoin is just so incredible, and without it you don't have Ethereum, right? So I think both of them are extremely valuable, but I think long-term impact Ethereum will have much more impact. When you get into which smart contract platforms are better and why, and what are the trade-offs and the consensus mechanisms and etc., I think you get into a very nuanced technical debate about kind of implementation details. I think Solana is a good idea at a conceptual level. Like a smart contract platform is a good idea. I don't dislike it for what it is. I just disagree with some of the trade-offs.
Kain, thank you very much. It was fun, and I think it was not only interesting, but it was also revealing and helpful for me, and I'm sure that the community, our community, will find it as interesting as I found it. So thanks a lot for your time, and that's it. Thanks.
Yeah, amazing. My pleasure. It was really fun. I had a good time.
Cool. Okay, we are good. Thank you very much, Kain.
Cool.
It was like,
No problem.
it was super